So we have this proliferation, we have this prevalence of things. Let me share with you our study. My colleagues and I did a study across, we call it Project Ready. We've been studying young adults from all across the country, 6 different sites. We do our data collection from, and we also collect data from their parents. We're the only research lab right now in the country that has young adult data and also parent data. Somehow we think that when kids turn 18, parents aren't in the mix as much. But also a difficult group to sample and to do survey with. You think it's tough getting hold of your own kids. Try getting hold of about 2,000 of them across the country. In our study, we were looking at 2 primary questions. The first one's going to make a lot of sense to you. The other one may not, and I want to point out why it's of relevance to us. The first question is, what are the levels of acceptance and use of pornography among young adults, and how do these patterns vary across age cohorts within this developmental period? The use part of that makes sense. We wanted to know, believe it or not, we do not have good, accurate description, details and data on the prevalence of pornography use in the country today. Among different age groups, among young adults, among parents and others, we don't have that type of pattern and understanding. What we also don't have and what is missing is levels of acceptance. And I'll show you why in a minute. Adding both of those is important. Not just how much do people use pornography, but also what are the levels of acceptance. And this becomes particularly important for us to understand both men's and women's experience with this. We also want to understand to what extent is pornography acceptance and use associated with other forms of risk behaviors in young adulthood, of sexuality, substance use, family formation patterns, these types of things. Because as was mentioned by some of our earlier individuals, this is not largely regarded as a risk behavior. This isn't seen as anything that's problematic. So we wanted to see where does it fit within this type of pattern. Let me just show you some of our data, and it captures what we're seeing, and it gives us some of the first good evidence we have and data we have about the prevalence rates. The acceptance of pornography today among young adult men and women across the country. We find that among young adult men, there's about a 2/3 acceptance rate. When asked, is this an acceptable behavior? Is this an acceptable way for you to express your sexuality? About 2/3 say that they agree. Ranges across a little bit of range, but falling on that side. Surprising to many, we also found that among our young adult women, half of the women agreed that this was acceptable, an acceptable pattern for people to use. Now you might take note, we also asked parents what they thought about this question. Notice the differences here. Of the fathers of young adults, just over 1/3 said that pornography was acceptable, where only 1 in 5 of mothers did. This brings some big questions for us with the rising generation. One, do we have a cohort effect here? Is this just simply a life cohort issue that as these young people move later into adulthood, they'll start to adopt patterns more like their parents? They'll see this through a different lens? That's one possibility. The other possibility, as the title of tonight's presentation suggests, we may have a new generation. A generation that because of the prevalence, because of the patterns around them, we see them developing new attitudes. So much so, if you look at this data, half of the young women, only 1/3 of their fathers. The young women in this sample are more accepting of pornography than their fathers are. That's a fundamentally different understanding than we've had around the typical gender patterns we've seen around pornography acceptance. So we see a number of issues here around this. Now pay attention to this next part. If you remember, the 2/3 acceptance of men, 1/2 acceptance of women, but then we see a dramatically different pattern in this national sample around use patterns. We see that 86% of the young men report using pornography, at least to some extent in their lives. We see a much less use among women, and the patterns are dramatically different if we take a look at how frequently they're using. If you notice among the young men, what we see is that about half of the young men are using at least weekly. 1 in 5, 20 to 25% of the young men are using daily. These patterns, if you want to put this in perspective, look exactly, almost exactly the same as the usage patterns we have of alcohol on college campuses today. And how much have we realized, and do we talk about as a society, the risks and the dangers of the alcohol cultures on our college campuses, and we say almost nothing about the pornography culture that is there as well. For women, though, while we see 1/3 use, notice that it is very infrequent. So what we see is much higher acceptance among women, much less use. Notice for men, 2/3 said it was acceptable, but how many are using? Almost 90%. There's an indicator right there that you have compulsive patterns and addictive patterns happening. That according to their own report, it's not acceptable, but I still do it. Still acting against their own conscience, against their own values, their own decisions there. But now I want to share something with you as we look at these associations. And we'll keep it simple tonight and not go crawling through too many analyses or other things. Check marks here represent an association where we see a correlated pattern where being elevated in the one area indicates an elevation on average in the other areas. So among young men, we see that their acceptance and use of pornography is associated with higher permissive sexuality in their own behaviors. It's not sitting as an isolated part of their sexuality. They have multiple sexual partners. They have more sexual partners in the last 12 months. They have casual sexual behaviors with people that they've just met or when they're intoxicated or have been drinking. It's also associated with higher binge drinking use and acceptance of cohabitation and other family formation patterns. Now look at the third column. This is a striking one from our data. This is young women's acceptance of pornography, not their use. Simply being more accepting of pornography, saying that it's okay, saying that it's something not to be concerned about, demonstrates higher levels of permissive sexuality, binge drinking, drug use, and acceptance of out-of-wedlock childbirth among college-age women, whether they're using pornography or not. This is worth considering and pondering on. Think about this. How much of our mainstream media demonstrates pornography as acceptable? Take a show like Friends, a sitcom like Friends. Very, very popular among our teens and young adults for a number of years. The men on that show were shown to participate and to use pornography on a regular basis. It was openly talked about. It was seen as normal. It was seen as an area of joke, an area of fun and laughter in this show. This is another thing that we need to think about, the pornography itself, but also the messages around it and how it is portrayed to young people and to teens. Because as we'll talk here in a minute, motivations and understandings about the reality of pornography are at the key of the battle. And fundamentally, it's not just the behavior. Pornography is a sexual ethic, both in the behavior that's engaged in, but also the understandings, the attitudes, the motivations and values that go with it. And what we see here, and this is where if you tie it back to what I said earlier about pornography industry targeting women, they now want to move from this higher acceptance to now including the behavior as well. So as we think about here and as we move forward, think about both our young men and our young women. And we think about the messages that are there. Because even if the use is not there, if the acceptance gets stronger, we will see increased patterns in these other risk behaviors and other types